In this video, I will cover everything you need to know about the Mercedes SLR McLaren supercar and why it's one of the greatest AMG-powered Mercedes ever produced. I'd like to thank RSC Motors for allowing me to film around this SLR, which is currently for sale. Send them a message on Instagram if you are interested in this 30,000 kilometer example from 2006. Starting with the history of the SLR, the Vision SLR concept was unveiled in 1999 at the Detroit Auto Show with the goal of beating Ferrari's 550 Maranello. The literature of the time touted an early idea of a supercharged V8 and a user-friendly design, all part of a long-distance Grand Tourer. The styling harked back to the SLR race cars of the 1950s, in which Juan Manuel Fangio and Stirling Moss drove to victory. In order to set the SLR concept into production, the project was handed over to McLaren under the leadership of engineering legend Gordon Murray. It was under Murray's previous project, the McLaren F1, where he and his team created what is now widely regarded as the greatest road car of all time. Mercedes also owned part of McLaren at the time and had a partnership with them in Formula One. Murray's expertise was put to good use, and the SLR concept was completely overhauled and improved for the final production car. Underneath was a completely flat floor and a rear diffuser that Murray insisted on. This meant that the exhaust system was relocated to the sides of the car, which also evoked the design of the SLR of the 1950s. The chassis and body of the car is entirely made of carbon fiber. The paint specifically developed for carbon fiber panels was done by hand for each car. Moving on to the engine of the SLR, named the M155, it was based on AMG's M113K engine of the time, featured in its 55 series cars like this E55. While these two engines both share many of the same design aspects, such as the compact 3-valve per cylinder heads and a twin-screw supercharger, there are some major changes that set the M155 apart. Starting with the aluminum 5.44-liter engine block, compared to the M113K, the M155 has a much stronger closed-deck engine block rather than an open-deck engine block. The compression ratio was slightly lowered to 8.8 to 1 rather than 9 to 1 in the M113K, and this is thanks to the SLR's forged pistons and high-strength forged connecting rods. The rev limiter is raised to 7,000 RPM compared to 6,500 RPM in the standard V8 Kompressor engines. For the SLR M155, the camshafts were upgraded with a more aggressive profile for more power, and the exhaust valves were optimized. The SLR also had a bigger 80mm throttle body compared to 74mm in the standard engine. A dry sump oil system allowed the engine not only to provide better lubrication, but also drop the engine lower down in the car. The M155 runs a thicker 5W50 motor oil compared to the 0W40 in the standard engine. The twin-screw supercharger in the SLR was upgraded to output 13 psi of boost as opposed to 11.6 in the standard car, and this was due to a better internal gear ratio. The oil of the supercharger became actively supplied rather than being an enclosed system. The dry sump oil system allowed the cooling system for the supercharger to be completely revised, with twin top-mounted intercoolers, each with their own water pumps. This provided much more effective cooling than the standard engine. The SLR's exhaust system was also better flowing than that of the standard 55 cars. All of these changes resulted in 626 horsepower, compared to around 500 for the M113K engine. Torque was up to 575 pound-feet, compared to 520. Finally, these engines were hand-assembled in Affalterbach, Germany, before being sent to England for the final assembly of the SLR cars. Gordon Murray opted for the supercharged V8 from AMG because of its compact design that allowed him to put the engine completely behind the front axle to provide the balance he wanted for a car of this caliber. Power was sent through a specially tuned 722.6 5-speed automatic transmission, which was completely overhauled for the SLR to have much quicker shifts than other AMG cars with this transmission. The rear end ratio was a shorter 3.06 compared to AMG's normal production cars of the time, which had 282 and 262 rear ends. The SLR had carbon ceramic brakes, and a rear air brake system, as well as double wishbone suspension in both the front and back. The SLR was unveiled in November 2003 after 4 years of back and forth between McLaren and Mercedes, with McLaren taking on the bulk of the development as well as production of the car. When the SLR was given to the press in 2004, the performance numbers were incredible for a relatively comfortable GT cruiser with a 98-liter fuel tank and 3,800 pounds of weight. Car and Driver magazine recorded a 0 to 60 time of 3.3 seconds while passing the quarter mile in 11.2 at 130 miles an hour. A few years later in 2006, the SLR 722 edition was released, with power increased to 641 horsepower, lightweight wheels, stiffer suspension, bigger brakes, and a front carbon fiber splitter, as well as an Alcantara interior. For 2007, the SLR Roadster was unveiled. Finally, for 2009, Mercedes also unveiled a 722 edition Roadster, as well as the SLR Sterling Moss. The Sterling Moss was the lightest and most powerful road-going SLR. Inspired by the 300 SLR race car, it had no windscreen or roof, 650 horsepower, and a top speed of 218 miles an hour. Only 75 of these were produced. A total of 2,157 SLRs were sold until production ended at the end of 2009. Some of the optional items on SLRs included red brake calipers, carbon fiber interior trim, special interior leathers such as this 300 SL Red, a two-tone steering wheel, and upgraded cross-drilled brakes. The SLR is truly one of the greatest AMG-powered Mercedes of all time because of its power, exclusivity, and unique McLaren input. Thanks for watching, and if you want to support the channel, buy a sticker from my store. Link is in the description. Otherwise, subscribe for more videos like this.